Historian and attorney Barbara Wingo received her Juris Doctor degree cum laude from SMU, her Master of Arts and Doctor of Philosophy degrees in history from Tulane, and her Bachelor of Arts degree from Stanford University. Dr. Wingo is a courtesy professor of history at the University of Florida, having previously served over 30 years as adjunct member of the Department of History at UF. She has served for over 30 years in the University of Florida's General Counsel's office, including service as Deputy General Counsel for 20 years. A recipient of the UF Presidential Medallion and a Fellow of the American Bar Foundation, Dr. Wingo is member of the boards of several historical and non-for-profit organizations, is the past president of the Friends of the Marjorie and St. Farm, Inc., the St. Augustine Historical Society, and the University of Florida Friends of Music. Dr. Wingo is vice president and curator of the Norman Studios Silent Film Museum and is frequent lecturer on silent films in Jacksonville, Norman Studios, Marjorie and St, and among other topics. Even after Marjorie and St moved to Cross Creek, she had homes elsewhere. In Florida, she had a house in Crescent Beach, about 10 miles from St. Augustine, and briefly an apartment in St. Augustine. Beginning in 1939, her refuge in Crescent Beach became critical to her as a place to do her writing. In the following years, and particularly after her marriage to her second husband, Norton Baskin, her personal, business, and social activities were predominantly associated with Crescent Beach and St. Augustine. This presentation will explore these activities and her relationship with the area. Barbara C. Wingo.
Since Marjorie was a writer, and of course an excellent writer, I will actually be reading from various of her works and her letters in this presentation. I start out with a brief chronology just to put in context when she comes to St. Augustine and Crescent Beach. Get more into that in the next slide. After she publishes the Yearling in 1938, she is, of course, quite a celebrity, and she has very much less privacy at Cross Creek. She also sells her movie rights, the movie rights to that book at that time as well, and you'll see how that enters into her using the cottage at Crescent Beach, in particular for her writing. And here we see, this is just continuing the chronology. I'm going to fill in what happens, but just to give everyone an idea of what we're talking about in terms of time frame. During the time that she's in St. Augustine as well, or in Crescent Beach as well, we have to remember that certain things are also happening, like the Zelma Kaysen lawsuit that is filed in 1943, and we will note that that has an effect on her writing, on her life, as does the fact that her husband goes to war, and then the running of the Castle Warden Hotel, which we will talk about in more detail. So let's start out by looking at some references to St. Augustine in her works prior to 1939. In South Moon Under, she talks about the fort, she talks about the dungeon. You know, Zeke went on, people must have purely dreaded that place in those days. You'd have thought they'd kept out of devilment. Some of them hadn't done anything, Lant reminded him, like the Injun Osceola, where they showed he tried to get out and he couldn't make it. Zeke nodded. He grieved himself to death. Lance said he just couldn't make out without his freedom. In the yearling, we find this dialogue between Jody and Fodderwing. I know something I bet you don't know. What? The Spaniards used to cross the scrub right in front of our gate. Why, I know that, Fodderwing hunched close and began to whisper excitedly. I see them. Jody stared at him. What you see? I see the Spaniards. They're all tall and dark and have shiny helmets and they ride black horses. You couldn't see them. There ain't none left. They done left here just like the Injuns. Fodderwing closed one eye wisely. That's what folks will tell you. You listen to me. Next time you go west of your sinkhole, you know that big magnolia with dogwood all around it? You look behind that magnolia. There's always a Spaniard on a black horse riding past that magnolia. The hair stiffened on Jody's neck. This was, of course, another of Fodderwing's tales. This is why his father and mother said Fodderwing was crazy, but he longed to believe it. It would do no harm, at least to look behind the magnolia. Later, Jody lay up flat on his belly, staring into the flames. It was here that he was often able to see Fodderwing's Spaniard. He asked, did the Spaniards have red capes? This is a page from Cross Creek Cookery with a recipe for Minorcan gopher stew. A group that Marjorie admired and found sympathetic were the Minorcans. Again, this is from the yearling. Jody said, look, Pa, there's people. And of course, as I read this, understand that some of the language is a bit dated as we go through all of these readings. Human beings were a stranger sight in a lonely place of live oak islands and sawgrass, ponds and prairies than the creatures. Penny shaded his eyes. A file of half a dozen men and women was entering the scrub road they had just left behind. It's the Minorcans, he said, hunting gophers. Jody now saw the sacks over their shoulders, the small, dusty land turtles whose deep burrows were an indication of the porous soil, were the last food most inhabitants of the South considered edible. I've always wondered, Penny said, didn't they make a medicine maybe out of the gophers? Don't seem like they'd come here clear from the coast to hunt them just to eat. Let's slip back close and look at them, Jody said. I'd not pry on the poor things, Penny said. The Minorcans is a people was might bad put upon. My father knowed their full story. An English feller carried them to New Smyrna over by the ocean and the Indian River. He promised them a pure heaven and put them to work. And when times got bad and the crops failed, he left them to nigh starve to death. There weren't many left. The procession disappeared into the scrub. Jody sighed, and the hair stirred on the back of his neck. It was like seeing Spaniards. It was as though phantoms dark and shadowy, and not men and women, had passed before him, weighed with their strange burden of gophers and injustice. In Cross Creek Cookery, Marjorie talks about the Minorcans and takes advantage of one of their recipes, the Minorcan gopher stew. And here we have it. I'm sorry, I did miss one of the slides there. I have to look occasionally, apparently, at the slides to make sure I'm hitting the button correctly. In Cross Creek Cookery, she notes, behind Florida seafoods are all the beauty and excitement of lake and river and the great sea itself. The little shrimp boats bob like tops in front of my summer cottage on the ocean. Their nets, larger than the boats themselves bring into the St. Augustine wholesale markets the jumbo shrimp that are such a nutty delectability, have such a nutty delectability. A man wades bare-legged at low tide in the salt Matanzas River. He throws with incredible grace his cast nets and brings in the small, sweet river shrimp so fine for cocktails or Perlo. Oh, what is that cottage that she's referring to? She began renting a cottage at Crescent Beach in July of 1939, and then bought the property shortly later. Here she's talking about putting up her name on the mailbox. People she's talking about are Curtis Clark, who was the manager of the Marion Refrigerator Company in Ocala, Robert Camp, who did the sketches actually for Cross Creek Cookery, as well as Norton Baskin. Now, who is Norton Baskin? Norton Baskin managed the Hotel Marion in Ocala, and by 1937, 1938, Marjorie and Norton had become a serious couple. Here are some other friends from Crescent Beach and St. Augustine. Verl and Edith Pope. They were, that is, Verl was an insurance agent and later a state senator, and Edith Pope was a novelist. Well, what is she talking about here about her initiation into floundering? And this is going to be my longest reading of the day, about how she describes her initiation into floundering that Verl brought about. We set out at 9 o'clock at night at low tide and parked the car down one of those roads that lead toward the ocean on the island here. Verl carried a big gasoline lantern and we all had gigs. We walked along in the shallow water for about a mile before we got the first flounder. The floundering itself is fascinating. They don't move when the light is on them, and you jug them with a gig, then reach under them, and somebody puts them on a string. I don't know how far we walked, all in the water. All of a sudden, even the men admitted they were tired, and we had all that way to go back home again. We must have gone about 3 miles then. Meanwhile, the tide had come in and was close to high, and everything looked different. We walked, and all of a sudden we were lost. The lighthouse was on the wrong side, and so was the moon. Sometimes things would drop from under us, and we were in over our waists. That was plenty spooky. Verl left us to reconnoiter, and then couldn't find us again. At last we got together again and walked, pushing through the deep water. We could hardly put one foot ahead of the other. We found the car at 2 o'clock in the morning, having walked steadily for 5 hours. When we set out and didn't get any flounder for so long, I said smoothly, "So this is floundering?" Then we caught a lot fast, and I said with enthusiasm, "So this is floundering." As we struggled in at the end, I said bitterly, "So this is floundering." On October 27, 1941, Marjorie and Norton were married at the courthouse in St. Augustine. So another St. Augustine reference here. Verl and Edith Pope were in attendance along with Ida Tarrant, who was Charles Rawlings' great aunt, whom Marjorie had basically adopted. Now, Marjorie and Norton decided to enter into a venture that would bring them closer together in the sense that they would be living in the same area. And that was to buy the Castle Warden, which was a private residence, and then turn it into a hotel. The hotel started with maybe not the most auspicious beginning. because its opening day was December 7th, 1941. And I will say the whole idea that they could make a life for themselves in the hotel was also very inauspicious. Marjorie detested hotel life. Even though Norton in this case had actually built them a separate apartment in the hotel, but she really did dislike hotel living, and that's putting it mildly. She wrote in March of 1942 to Maxwell Perkins, her erstwhile editor, "I am slowly making adjustment to life in St. Augustine, but it's difficult. I had thought and hoped that perhaps I had wrung dry the backwoods section and living, but there is something there from which I cannot seem to tear away. My husband is so completely lovely a person, and it grieves me to see him grieved when I simply have to clear out and go back to the creek. Actually, there is a whole new literary field before me in the old town of St. Augustine, and I really hope that in time I shall be able to sink myself into it." Unfortunately, she never followed up on that particular insight. She never followed up with the Menorcans, the Spanish influence, and so forth. As the wife of a hotelier in St. Augustine, she tended to mingle simply with the upper echelon of St. Augustine society, so not replicating her life, shall we say, from Cross Creek, and therefore not getting into what she had seen was a fertile field in St. Augustine for literary mining, so to speak. At the same time, the cottage at Crescent Beach, even though the apartment in the hotel was not conducive to much of anything, except her leaning on the fireplace there, or on the mantel. Smoking, of course smoking. Well, at least she's not drinking in that picture.
She just finished a drink. Yeah, I was gonna
She
say.
just finished her drink. I mean, there are great stories about her at the hotel, like going down the stairway, and she had a cigarette in her hand and a cigarette holder and being the grande dame, but she really did not like that life. So, what about Crescent Beach? Could we do something there? Could we make a life there, not too far from St. Augustine, and maybe that would be more conducive to their marriage? Well, we have World War II, which maybe it was definitely presaged by the fact that their opening was of the hotel was on a particular date, of course. Norton decided to enlist as an ambulance driver with the American Field Service. This led to extensive correspondence with him, which is very enjoyable for us to read now, but of course a lot of worry on her part. Also during the war, extensive correspondence with military men. The large book drives that the American Library Association had sponsored had led to books being sent to military men all over the world, and led then to letters to writers, and also led to the actual publishing by the military of editions. So Marjorie certainly decided that it was a good idea and felt actually morally obligated to write to the servicemen who sent letters to her. She was also in the war, she was an airplane spotter, and she was at the same time, of course, still in that tenuous position with her lawsuit in Cross Creek, which she claimed was, of course, debilitating, but maybe not the whole reason she was not writing as much at that particular point in time. The two questions that she seems to have concentrated on, other than the war itself, during these years and that are associated with her time in Crescent Beach and St. Augustine is, how can I be a better wife? My first marriage failed. How can I do better? How can I reconcile the two different worlds, the hotel world and my world, whatever that might be, which is pretty peripatetic actually. How can I do that? And the other was how to solve the quote, Negro question in terms of her own attitudes and actions. Those are very serious questions. Therefore, I have to bring up something else that happened during the war that isn't maybe quite as serious. I realized all my underwear was ragged. She writes to Norton in December of 1943, and I went to Acris, I am pronouncing that correctly, I believe, in St. Augustine to stock up. I was allowed to buy only 2 slips, 1 brassiere and 2 pairs of panties. And the panties were the dreadfully old-fashioned kind with drawstrings. You can imagine what's going to happen in the rest of this letter. I'm not going to quote it here because we are a mixed company. In spite of all this, her social activities did continue throughout the year. The war, Cross Creek Cookery, written in 1942, less formal writing thereafter, although she began her next novel, The Sojourner, as well. Another friend was Fred Francis. This is Fred Francis's poem, Hunta Hunta Hera, and he was a favorite bridge partner. Norton and Marjorie loved to play bridge. And obviously, Francis's wife, Jean Francis, was another favorite partner. She referred to Fred, Jean, and Ruth Pickering as our St. Augustine family. We'll come back to Ruth Pickering momentarily. Zora Neale Hurston was another leading figure in her life at St. Augustine, particularly in 1942. Not only did they have the tea together in July of 1942, but in that year, of course, Zora was controversial in the sense that she had a controversy with the newly appointed president of the Florida Normal and Industrial School here in St. Augustine about the treatment of various students there. During this period, the period of the war, she really looks at her relationship with Zora Neale Hurston and the whole question, as it was referred to then, the quote, Negro question, end quote. Here she is saying, she is actually talking about something that happened at Cross Creek, which was that she found out that she could have Zora in her house, stay overnight in her house. But note, it has always surprised me that my thinking is so Southern, but I felt that if I ever was to prove my humanitarian and moral beliefs, even if it cost me the lawsuit, I must do it then. Always she is worried about the lawsuit, her husband's business, and that prevents her from ever fully going in to a more vigorous defense of Black rights. I think one of the most important, or one of the most interesting letters that she wrote during this period concerned her interactions with the Pledge for Peace Committee of the Writers' War Board. She was asked to do a 150-page essay on the war, on a war theme, and she sent them a true story that she called The Southern Soldier and the Negro. Sitting in a diner on the train the previous summer, she asked a soldier sitting next to her, how does the Army feel about fraternizing with Negroes? The soldier answered with a drawl, well, lady, I'm from the South myself, but all I can say is, If a man's good enough to die for his country, he's good enough to live with. This article was rejected as too controversial. I wrote back that I could not provide any starry-eyed platitudes, as the stand we were taking on the Negro to me invalidated the whole war, for there was nothing of the noble crusade in setting out to stop other nations from doing precisely what we intended to keep on doing to the Negro. And she saw the same ambivalence and problems in Claude Pepper. Yes, she said, I have been a Claude Pepper supporter in spite of his patent demagoguery, for the reasons he has taken a courageous stand on many unpopular questions. And presumably, he is taking the stand, for example, that he agreed with the Supreme Court that blacks could vote in both the Democratic primary. Remember, this is the time when only the Democratic primary was all that mattered, because that would determine the election. And also remember that the poll tax was another way to keep blacks from voting. So Claude Pepper's being not in favor of those, in fact against the poll tax, endeared him to Marjorie. But at the same time, he said that, oh, of course we'll find a way to maintain white supremacy. Probably Claude's opponents are great as demagogues as he, but I mean to investigate. Actually, I think that once Claude was safely in again, he would be liberal, for he has always been and has fought the poll tax laws. He is fighting for his political life, and of course, I am being just as cowardly in holding my horses on the Negro questions until the lawsuit is settled. Now, apparently this worked for Pepper because he did win the Democratic primary and therefore the election. And again, very similar to Marjorie's ideas, I'm going to hold off. I'm not going to do anything that radical because of the lawsuit, my husband's business. In 1944, in April of 1944, there was a serious fire in the castle warden, and 2 people were killed, including her good friend, Ruth Pickering. And this, of course, caused a great deal of chagrin on the part of Marjorie. He had to really deal with it because Norton was in service. Eventually, Norton returned to Florida in the fall of 1944 after being seriously ill. The question, even after he got well, of course, the question still was, how are they going to make their life together here? And when he comes back, begins to work at the hotel, it's difficult logistically because they're in 2 different places, and there's a lot of problems that mean that it doesn't seem like there's a real solution to the problem of this marriage. Now, in 1946, Norton and Marjorie decide to sell the castle warden. And Norton becomes the manager of 2 restaurants in Marineland, the Periwinkle and the Dolphin Restaurant. There's a lot of talk, and there is remodeling of the cottage in Crescent Beach, later called by Marjorie the New Beach Mansion. At the same time, again, this was happening, but we see also Marjorie at the same time buying a place in Van Hornsville. These are just showing the Dolphin Restaurant. The Crescent Beach property remained the primary place that Marjorie and Norton lived together. At the same time, it is also the primary place where they met famous literary characters of the day. The famous story about Ernest Hemingway was seeing Ernest Hemingway in Greenland and writing a note to him saying, "Are you Ernest Hemingway?" And he writing back saying, "I'm Ernest Hemingway if you're Marjorie can enroll me." So, and they had a famous drinking bout at the Crescent Beach house. A.J. Cronin, the Scottish novelist, most famous for The Citadel and The Keys of the Kingdom and the Green Years, he became a fan of Marjorie, particularly after reading Cross Creek, which he noted he loved for the descriptions of the area, but also for the descriptions of the food, because he invited her to Maine so she could have some of their dry beans and stinking fish cakes, as a contrast to what she was showing in her book. She answered him with some of her recipes, and then he said, "My goodness, you're living in St. Augustine. Did you actually make those dishes then, or was it your husband's chef in the hotel? You are unmasked, Madame de Pompadour."
Fighting words.
And Edith Cope, we mentioned her already, who certainly Marjorie introduced her to Scribner's, and Corton, her most famous book, was published in 1944, and finally Robert Frost. On this slide, he also visited Marjorie. And as she said at one point, "How I love him." James Branch Cabell, I'm pronouncing that one right too, was a Virginia author of satirical fantasy fiction, which is not a genre we see much anymore. He was a winter resident of the Buckingham Hotel in St. Augustine, but he was a very good friend of both Marjorie and of Norton. In fact, after his first wife died, Marjorie introduced him to the person that eventually became his second wife. So There Were Two Pirates, which was actually dedicated to Marjorie by Cabell, and The Devil's Own, Dear Son, which was dedicated to Norton Baskin, in part because of his large knowledge of the tourist trade, but above all because of my large admiration. These are actually fun books to read. They're all rather satiric about the tourist trade. The main character in the latter being Diego de Arredondo Dodd. And finally, I'm just going to briefly mention a very, very important part of what brought Marjorie and Norton together and was part of their life in Crescent Beach, and that was entertaining. There's a little bit about the Forks. So, correspondence with Norton saying, "What are you doing with the Forks down there at Crescent Beach?" She was in Cross Creek at that time. "Adela told me the Forks were in bad shape, so use some of the forks from the Dolphin Restaurant." She had a lot of silverware. She loved silverware. She loved to find things for her entertaining. After all, food imaginatively and lovingly prepared and eaten in good company warms the being with something more than the mere intake of calories. I have to read just one menu that she did. I had my wild mallard duck dinner here at the cottage for several friends, and it was really delicious. Iced honeydew melon with lime juice, roast wild duck, wild rice, carrot souffle, fresh lime and bean croquettes, whole small braised white onions, tiny cornmeal muffins, kumquat jelly, celery hearts instead of a salad, fresh mango ice, and most hopelessly, because one of the men is crazy about it, devil's food cake. Is that enough for you? I had a heavenly time cooking it, she wrote to Max Perkins. Another of her friends was Owen D. Young, who and her wife, Louise, were two of the people that she entertained routinely in Crescent Beach, and also in her farmhouse in Van Hornsville, where Young had a home. In fact, Young, who was a businessman lawyer, best known as the founder of RCA as a subsidiary of General Electric, he was actually instrumental in getting Marjorie to buy the place in Van Hornsville. In some ways, he became a kind of substitute for Maxwell Perkins after Maxwell Perkins died. But it is important to note, for our purposes of St. Augustine, that he also had a winter home near St. Augustine, Washington Oaks, which is now a state park, and which he had built in 1938. So in closing, perhaps Marjorie never did find the perfect formula for her to be a better wife to Norton, but entertaining did combine her love of food and Norton's love of company. At the same time, Norton, always supportive of Marjorie and her writings, accepted and aided her in her increasingly peripatetic lifestyle, a lifestyle that was, for them, centered in Crescent Beach and St. Augustine. It was also a lifestyle that ended there. She became ill while she and Norton were playing bridge with the Youngs and died at Flagler Hospital in St. Augustine on December 14th.